I don't think I could do this anymore. I don't know why, but I'm okay with walking away from this because there's no way I'm dragging down the leg.
A 64-year-old rock legend stood at the edge of a Madison Square Garden stage, put his hand over his chest, and told 20,000 people he could not finish the show. This was not stage fright. This was not a bad night. This was the sound of a decade-long secret finally catching up with one of the biggest voices in rock and roll history. And by the time you finish this video, you will understand exactly why it happened, and why it may not be over. It was July 23, 2026, and Madison Square Garden was packed for the 8th night of a sold-out 9-show residency. Bon Jovi had opened their Forever tour just over 2 weeks earlier, and the buzz around New York City was electric. Fans who had already caught earlier shows in the run knew this was supposed to be a triumphant return, the payoff after years of uncertainty about whether Jon Bon Jovi would ever tour again. But about 90 minutes into the performance, after roughly 13 or 14 songs instead of the 20-plus fans had come to expect from the earlier nights, something visibly shifted. Jon's voice, which had carried the arena through the first stretch of the set, began to thin out. The power that defines a Bon Jovi chorus was missing, replaced by a strained, breathless quality that grew more noticeable with every song. Before what would become the final number of the night, Jon walked to the front of the stage and did something most performers at his level almost never do in front of a paying crowd. He told the truth in real time. He said he knew he was letting them down, and that it wasn't like him to do that. He asked the crowd for help getting through one more song, admitting that he was struggling. Then, in a moment nobody in that building will ever forget, Train frontman Pat Monahan, who happened to be in the audience that night as a regular fan with no scheduled role in the concert, was pulled backstage and brought out to help carry the vocals on Living on a Prayer. Even with Monahan sharing the load, Jon leaned heavily on the audience to sing the words back to him. When the song ended, Jon told the crowd not to throw away their ticket stubs, because he was going to find a way to make it up to them and reschedule. He hugged each member of his band, gave the audience a thumbs up, and walked off stage roughly an hour and a half after the show began. A representative for the band later confirmed to multiple outlets that Jon had been battling a sinus infection, which led to the early ending. That explanation was accurate as far as it went. But for anyone who has followed Jon Bon Jovi's voice over the past decade, a sinus infection was only the spark. The real story goes back much further, and it is far more painful than a stuffy nose. To understand what happened on that stage in July, you have to go back more than 10 years, to a moment that quietly reshaped everything for Jon Bon Jovi, even though almost nobody realized it at the time. In 2013, longtime guitarist Richie Sambora abruptly left the band partway through the Because We Can tour, walking away during a period he later attributed to personal and family struggles. Sambora wasn't simply a guitarist standing off to the side. For 3 decades he had been Jon's vocal partner on stage, trading lines and stacking harmonies that helped define the Bon Jovi sound. When he exited, the band still had dozens of tour dates left to play, and Jon was suddenly covering both his own vocal parts and the harmonies Sambora used to handle, night after night, for the rest of that run. Jon has said publicly, including in an interview with AARP magazine, that it was after that stretch of touring when things started to change for his voice, and that even he couldn't say for certain whether the toll was more physical or psychological. Whatever the exact cause, the warning signs kept building through the following years. By the mid-2010s, longtime fans and critics alike began noticing a breathiness in his singing, less raw power behind the big choruses, and occasional moments where his pitch would waver in a way it never used to. Jon has talked about this period candidly in interviews, describing his body essentially crashing on him without his fully realizing how serious it had become. In the years that followed, he tried nearly everything short of surgery to hold onto his voice. According to the Hulu docuseries Thank You, Good Night, which chronicles this period of his life and career, Jon experimented with laser treatments, acupuncture, vitamin regimens, collagen injections, and constant vocal exercises, all in an effort to keep performing at the level his fans expected. He kept touring through those years anyway, pushing through shows while quietly managing a problem that was getting worse underneath the surface. Then came the pandemic. The forced 2-year pause in touring that hit every musician on the planet didn't give Jon's voice time to heal. If anything, it made the decline impossible to hide any longer. When Bon Jovi returned to the stage in 2022, longtime fans immediately noticed the difference, and it was around this time that the person closest to Jon finally said out loud what everyone else had been too afraid, or too polite, to say. After a 2022 show in Nashville, Jon came off stage believing he had given the crowd everything he had. He turned to his wife, Dorothea, and told her the show had gone well. She didn't agree. She told him it wasn't great, and reminded him that she had seen him be great before. Jon and Dorothea have been together since high school, married since 1989, and have stood beside each other through every stage of Bon Jovi's now 4-decade career. Jon later described that conversation to People magazine as devastating, but said there was no one on earth better positioned to tell him the truth than she was. He has talked about how everyone else around a performer at his level tends to fall into one of a few categories. People who are paid to keep him happy, people who genuinely idolize him and don't want to see anything wrong, or people simply too intimidated to be honest. Dorothea, he said, was the one person who would never soften the truth for him. What's striking is what his mind did with that information in the moment. He has said that his first instinct, hearing his wife's honest assessment, wasn't to think about seeing a doctor or resting his voice. It was to think it might be time to retire. That single detail says a lot about how much psychological weight he had quietly been carrying for years without admitting it to anyone, including himself. For a performer whose entire identity has been built around his voice since he was a teenager in Sayreville, New Jersey, the fear of losing that instrument isn't just a career worry. It cuts much deeper than that. Within days of that conversation, Jon drove himself to the hospital. Not an assistant, not a scheduled consultation weeks out. He got in a car and went, because the urgency to find out what was happening to his voice outweighed everything else. What doctors found was worse than he expected. He has since described, both in interviews and in the Hulu docuseries, that one of his vocal cords had essentially atrophied. Healthy vocal cords are supposed to be roughly symmetrical, moving and vibrating together. His had become uneven, with one cord swollen and the other significantly weaker, effectively being pushed out of position every time he tried to sing. Doctors told him that some degree of vocal fold thinning is a natural part of aging, but that decades of performing at an extremely high level, night after night on tour, had accelerated the damage well beyond what would be considered normal for his age. Jon has pointed out that this wasn't the result of carelessness. He never smoked, never used drugs, always warmed up before shows and cooled down afterward, and had trained as a vocalist for decades. The instrument still failed him anyway. To repair it, surgeons performed a procedure that involved placing implants near the vocal cords to help push the weaker one back into a more functional position, essentially trying to restore symmetry so both cords could vibrate together again. Jon has referred to it informally as something like a facelift for his vocal cords. The surgery itself was considered successful, but it was only the starting point of a much longer process. For roughly the next several years, Jon worked through extensive vocal therapy, uncertain at multiple points whether he would ever be able to tour again at the level fans expected. He has spoken about how that period was filled with small moments of hope followed by fresh setbacks over and over, as he tried to relearn how to use a voice that had been surgically altered. By April of 2024, the uncertainty was serious enough that Jon gave an interview to the Sunday Times where he said, plainly, that if his singing wasn't going to be great, and he couldn't be the performer he once was, then he would rather walk away and be at peace with that. He compared the decision to a quarterback who knows he's thrown his last pass. And in that same conversation, he used a phrase that captured exactly what he was afraid of becoming. He said he never wanted to be remembered as the version of a legendary performer who kept going long after his best years were behind him, propped up by nostalgia rather than genuine ability. Through all of this uncertainty, something remarkable happened around him that deserves just as much attention as the medical story. Not a single member of the band walked away. Drummer Tico Torres stayed. Keyboardist David Bryan stayed. Guitarist Phil X, bassist Hugh McDonald, guitarist and songwriter John Shanks, and percussionist Everett Bradley all kept showing up to rehearsals, even during stretches when there was no tour on the calendar and no certainty one would ever happen again. Jon has spoken about this loyalty with real emotion, telling People magazine that the sacrifices his bandmates made during that period were on another level entirely, and that they told him again and again they were with him, no matter how long it took. Even Richie Sambora, who hadn't performed with the band since his departure back in 2013, publicly said he would be open to returning if Jon fully recovered his voice, telling an interviewer that he had songs ready and believed the world needed the band back together. More than a decade after their split, the door was still open. In October of 2025, Jon appeared on The Today Show and made the announcement fans had been waiting years to hear. Bon Jovi would return to the stage with the Forever Tour, anchored by a 9-night residency at Madison Square Garden. It was framed as both a comeback and a statement, proof that the years of surgery, therapy, and self-doubt had led somewhere. The tour opened on July 7, 2026, with no opening act and a pack house waiting under the lights. Jon chose to open the night with a cover of With a Little Help from My Friends, performed in the soulful arrangement popularized by Joe Cocker rather than the original Beatles version. Given everything he had been through, the song choice landed as something much more personal than a typical set opener. He told the crowd that night that he hadn't heard a live audience in 4 years and thanked them for waiting for him. The reviews that followed were largely positive, though honest about the differences fans could hear and see. His voice sounded different from the version audiences remembered from decades earlier, and he moved around the stage less, staying closer to the microphone stand rather than sprinting across the arena floor the way he once did. Still, he made it through a full 21-song set, and for those first several shows, it looked like the comeback was holding. Fans flew in from around the world for the residency, filling the arena's concourse with multiple languages on any given night. But a 9-show run packed into just under 3 weeks is a demanding schedule for any singer, let alone one whose vocal cords are held in position by surgical implants and who is only a few years removed from wondering if he would ever perform live again. By the 6th night, subtle cracks had already started to show. The band quietly dropped 2 of their most vocally demanding songs, Wanted Dead or Alive and Always, from the setlist without any public explanation. 2 nights later, on night 8, his body made the decision that his will alone couldn't override, and the show came to its early, emotional end. In the days that followed the cancellation, the band's official schedule still listed the 9th and final Madison Square Garden show for that Sunday, along with a run of European dates later in the year, including stops in Edinburgh, Dublin, and multiple nights at Wembley Stadium in London. The stakes attached to those remaining shows are enormous, not only financially for the band and the touring operation behind them, but emotionally for the tens of thousands of fans who had already booked flights and hotels to be there. And that puts Jon in a position he hoped his surgery had settled for good. Back in 2024, he had drawn a clear line for himself, saying he never wanted to be the artist who kept pushing through diminished performances out of ego or obligation to a legacy he had already secured many times over. The same man who once drove himself to the hospital because he was desperate to save what was left of his voice is now facing a version of that same choice again, on a much bigger stage, in front of a much larger audience. The sinus infection was the immediate, literal reason the show ended early that night. But anyone who has followed this story closely understands that the infection was simply the trigger, not the underlying cause. The real story is about a performer who spent more than 4 decades refusing to give his audience anything less than everything he had, and a rebuilt voice that is now being tested at the exact scale that pushed it to the breaking point in the first place. Jon Bon Jovi's career has always been defined by resilience. He was the teenager from Sayreville, New Jersey, who opened for ZZ Top at Madison Square Garden back in 1983 and went on to help sell well over 100 million records worldwide across a career spanning generations. Along the way, he has weathered major lineup changes, the loss of original bassist Alec John such in 2022, a slow and largely hidden vocal decline that built for the better part of a decade, career-threatening surgery, and years of rehabilitation that at multiple points pushed him right up to the edge of retirement. He has said in past interviews that turning 60 felt different from turning 50, and that his biggest fear wasn't losing fame or record sales, it was the possibility of losing the ability to sing at all.